2024 Republican presidential candidate Ron DeSantis recently discussed what he perceives to be uneven voting terrain for the GOP and how he would handle it differently than Donald Trump did in 2020. Intrigued? Then click that like and subscribe and enjoy the video. So one of the common complaints from the right and the Republican Party in general, and Donald Trump in particular, about the 2020 presidential election and election... So one of the common complaints... about the 2020 presidential election and subsequent elections from the right, Donald Trump in particular, and Republicans... So one of the common complaints about the 2020 presidential election and subsequent midterms from the right and Republicans in general, and Donald Trump in particular, is that the voting landscape is uneven. It's not fair to Republicans due to COVID-era exhalations of voting restrictions and things like that, certain accommodations with respect to absentee ballots and mail-in voting and ballot harvesting and things like that. Republicans don't like it. And the reason Republicans don't like it is because, and they have said it consistently, Donald Trump publicly said it consistently, Lindsey Graham publicly said it consistently, Republican attorneys arguing before the Supreme Court said it consistently, that if and when voter turnout is maximized for eligible voters, so the more eligible voters vote, it's bad news for Republicans electorally. Donald Trump once famously said that Republicans would never win another election if you maximize eligible voter turnout, which is part of the reason why the Republican Party has retreated from, renewing federal voting protections and things like that, and voting for like the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment and so on and so forth. Even though on paper, it's not like it would just directly benefit Democrats or liberals. It would benefit the voting electorate period, eligible voters period, including conservative voters in red states. It would just increase turnout across the board. It's not like these laws are gerrymandered to favor blue states and not red states. Democrats want to maximize absentee balloting and mail-in voting and all these things in all 50 states, including red states, which would make it easier for Republicans to vote as well. We want to make it as easy as possible for people to vote, for eligible voters to vote. And we also feel that way because statistics have shown, the evidence has shown again and again and again and again, even under Republican Justice Departments and investigations by Republican officials, voter fraud is relatively minor. It is a statistical blip. And it's very often committed by Republican voters, by the way. So this idea that it does happen, it's a big deal, and Democrats do it. No. It does happen. It's not a big deal. And when it's done, Republicans do it too. All that aside. So Republicans complain, however, that because of these efforts to increase voter turnout during a pandemic, make it easier and safer for people to vote, that was unfair. And it stole the election from Donald Trump. So in a recent conversation with Ben Shapiro, Ron DeSantis has asked about this, and I want you to hear what he has to say because it's really interesting from a political perspective, and it has the benefit of criticizing Donald Trump, which we don't hear Ron DeSantis do more often, and again, we need to hear more of. We want them to fight as much as possible. That's good for Democrats. So let's play the clip and unpack what he has to say.
So Governor DeSantis, one of the big questions that comes up in the presidential election, happened in 2020, I'm sure it'll happen again in 2024, is Donald Trump claims that the 2020 election was rigged. And this raises a question, even if you believe that that's true, how do you plan to reverse that sort of thing? If you're worried that the voting rules have changed, how do you plan to actually win, given the fact that 2020 didn't go the way that Donald Trump wanted it to go? Well, you obviously, in the state of Florida, took a very different tack, and you can see the results. You can see a 20-point shift between 2018 and 2020. Can you talk about your sort of on-the-ground strategy and how that would be different from what President Trump did in 2020 running against the Democrats?
Two things before we dive into this. First, okay, gang, my wife's a doctor, gang. Ben Shapiro's wife is a doctor. You need to know that. It's pertinent news. Second thing, note the premise to Ben's question. Hey, the voting rules were changed, which again increased eligible voter turnout. It made it easier for everyone, not just liberal voters, but conservative voters, not just in blue states, but also in red states, to vote. That's how the rules changed. And then he says, but you went, in Florida, you obviously went with a different tack, and it led to a 20-point shift, meaning you didn't make it easier for people to vote, including conservatives. And as a result, you benefited, your party benefited by 20 points. You went with an approach that made it difficult, or more difficult, relatively speaking, for people to safely and conveniently vote. And as a result, your party benefited. You see what I'm saying? It's not an egalitarian approach. It was a specifically targeted approach to suppress voter turnout for the opposition. Whereas the rule changes that were done elsewhere made it easier for everybody to vote. And we'll get into why conservatives didn't take advantage of that when the rules changed. But just want to point that out.
The left is going to throw the kitchen sink at any Republican. You've got to be ready for that. So in 2020, we saw these states, largely because of the Fauci state of emergency for COVID, they used that as a pretext to change the rules, the way voting happened. They embraced this mail balloting and ballot harvesting. Of course, I think that that's wrong. But if I were the candidate, I would.
Why does he think it's wrong? He's going to give you an explanation as to what he would do, accepting the premise, but why does he think it's wrong? What's wrong with mail-in voting? What's wrong with absentee voting? Do you have any compelling statistical evidence to suggest that mail-in voting, absentee voting is meaningfully abused, that it's meaningfully fraudulent? Do you have any evidence to support it? No, of course you don't, right? You just have a gut feeling that it would be subject to abuse, but you have no data to support it. And also, conservatives can take advantage of it as well. And by the way, what's wrong with ballot harvesting? What's wrong when I do a test? That's a hilarious, I just now noticed where we paused there. He's bugging out. But when I do a quiz in class or a test in class and somebody behind me gets up to turn in their paper, what's wrong with me handing that person my paper, my homework, my test, whatever, as they're going up to the desk? Are we worried they're going to change the answers? Do we have any evidence for that? Ballots are sealed. They're also signature verified. There are also protections against it. What are you so afraid of people just filling out ballots, right or left, and other people going to collect them? If there's fraud, punish the fraud. There are swift and harsh penalties for fraud, by the way. But this is something that would make it easier for liberals and conservatives in blue and red states to vote, make it so much easier, while also meaningfully protecting the validity and security of the election. Why do you oppose it? He doesn't tell you. But anyway, let's carry on to what he says next. He says, listen, these ideas are bad. Of course I oppose them. But, okay, so let's hear what he has to say.
Would have gone in and combated that, either had our people doing the same ballot harvesting or been more aggressive to try to head that off in terms of some of the legal challenges. I also look at how the federal government colluded with some of the tech companies to censor information, like the Hunter Biden story. That's election interference. It's totally unfair.
He's, of course, referring to the Twitter files, and of course he would do that because he's now Elon Musk's best friend and Elon Musk's preferred candidate. Musk has been very candid about this. I will remind everybody that when the Hunter Biden story broke, the federal government was led by Donald Trump. Donald Trump was the president of the United States, the head of state, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the head of government, the most powerful man in the world. It wasn't Joe Biden. The Biden campaign, not the government. So the FBI and the Justice Department were led by Trump appointees during Trump's administration. The revisionist history and how conservatives and the right and Republicans understand time is hilarious. They have no conception of how time works. They have this weird sort of atemporal Doctor Strange style time where future events happen in the past and present events happen in an alternate, like it's so bizarre. But anyway, let's carry on.
But I would also point out that was Donald Trump's FBI and Donald Trump's DHS that was doing that. He didn't have control over his own agencies. If somebody in my government were doing that, they would have been fired the next day. And so you've got to take the responsibility as the candidate to shape the battlefield in a way that's going to be most advantageous to your side winning. So what I'll do, obviously in Florida, we did it very effectively, but nationally, you look to see what the rules of the game are. Yes, we ban ballot harvesting in Florida. That's what you should do. Yes, we ban Zuckerbucks in Florida. That's what you should do. However, not every state has done that. So if you're in a state like Nevada, that's a mass mail balloting state with ballot harvesting and Zuckerbucks, we will have organizations in place so that we can exploit that system. If you have it in Wisconsin, we will have organizations in place to exploit that system. I think telling people not to send in a mail ballot is a huge mistake, and it ends up reducing the pool of prospective voters. In Florida, we focused on some of these low propensity voters in my reelection. They usually vote in presidential. They don't always vote in midterm, and we converted a lot of them to vote. Most of them chose to vote by absentee ballot through the mail. That was their choice. If we told them you could only vote on election day, some of them very well may not have voted. So understand the battlefield. It's your responsibility as a candidate to head off that, but every single candidate that we would nominate is going to face this from the left, the Democrats, and the media. And what I've told people, if you nominate me, I'm not going to make excuses. I'm going to get it done, and we'll be sworn in as president on January 20th, 2025.
So, Governor.
Okay, that was a lot. Okay, but it was so important. I don't like Ron DeSantis. I think Ron DeSantis is an authoritarian. I think that in many ways he's more competent than Donald Trump, to be sure. Perhaps in some ways he wouldn't be as dangerous. Do I know that if Ron DeSantis was elected on January, or I guess would be inaugurated January 21st, 2025, and then he ran for re-election and lost, right? So then on January 21st, 2030, do I think, or I guess it'd be 2029, do I think that if Ron DeSantis were elected and then lost re-election, am I convinced that he would necessarily do what Donald Trump did in terms of a January 6th? I have no evidence for that. I guess it wouldn't surprise me, but I'm not comfortable committing to that. So I don't know if he's as openly fascist or as nakedly, clumsily fascist as somebody like Donald Trump. That said, I don't think he'd be a good president. I don't think he has any meritable positions on matters of substance. I think he's just a, woke or anti-woke culture war talking point. We need something much, 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 much more than that from a chief executive. And his values suck and everything else. Having said that, I kind of appreciate the honesty of how he looks at this. See, DeSantis is a political animal with killer instincts. Now, I'm not saying those instincts are unerring, right? We've talked before about how he's made mistakes politically. But what I mean is when he engages politically, he understands that politics is, at least metaphorically, it's a battle. He uses the phrase battlefield, battlefield, battlefield. He sees it as a zero-sum game in certain respects, that he is in direct ideological, political competition with another side. So be it sports or battle, whatever it is, he is up against an opponent and the objective is to defeat that opponent. He wins, the opponent loses. I wish Democrats collectively had that sort of nakedly killer instinct because it's an asset for Republicans. Note what he says. He says, in his opinion, ballot harvesting, mail-in ballot, absentee ballots, in his opinion, are morally wrong. It's the wrong thing to do. Again, I disagree with that. I think it's ridiculous, but that's his opinion. But then note what he says next. He's not going to be bound by principle. Yes, I think they're the wrong thing to do. No, I don't think that's right. I don't agree with it. But I would do it anyway. I would do it. That's what I did in Florida. That's how I won in Florida. So this is a man who's basically unshackled to principle. And I wish we lived in an Aaron Sorkin West Wing style world where we would all, liberals, leftists, progressives, conservatives, Republicans, whatever, that we would all adhere to principle and debate the issues in good faith. But that's not the world we live in. And the Republican Party does not engage in good faith opposition. DeSantis' words right here are proof of that. He's saying, look, I'm not going to be tethered to principle in pursuit of political power. I will engage in the very tactics that I perceive my enemy to engage in, even if I believe that they're wrong. And he just said, he admitted, in Florida, he won in part because he engaged on those same terms. He encouraged mail-in voting. He encouraged absentee ballot. He encouraged maximizing voter turnout with people, constituencies, and demographics that leaned to support him, but typically didn't turn up unless it was a presidential election. That's voter outreach, targeted voter outreach, but that's voter outreach. So the bottom line is this. DeSantis understands and is very transparent about the adversarial element, the adversarial nature of politics. That will be an asset to him. Perhaps not all the time, and perhaps it won't be enough to let him win, but that's going to be an asset because his base wants a fighter. And believe it or not, so do progressives. So do we on the left. We do want a fighter. We want a certain type of fighter. We don't want, in this metaphor, an evil warlord like the Republicans are looking for, but we want a very strong defender of democratic principles and progressive values. We want people who aren't meek and timid, who just roll over and show their belly. We want people who are willing to wrestle and engage for the sake of progressive values, which, by the way, would benefit more than just progressives, would benefit conservatives. It would benefit red states, not just blue states. That's the sort of energy we want. That's the sort of energy we need. When you're in a direct opposition against a bad faith, disloyal opposition party who just told you they don't care about principles or consistency, they will willingly embrace those tactics that they personally say are morally wrong, like ballot harvesting or absentee or mail-in vote, just it's insane that that's considered and morally wrong by Republicans, but they will eagerly use those. We need Democratic candidates, Democratic nominees, Democratic representatives. We need Dark Brandon to start to exude that as well. Like, listen, Republicans will bend norms, change norms for their benefit. And their benefit is actually to the detriment of their own constituents. It actually benefits a very small percentage of the Republican Party, namely its leadership. And they'll do it in bad faith for authoritarian purposes. So maybe Democrats should feel encouraged to bend and change norms and institutions for democratic purposes, for progressive purposes, which would not only benefit their own constituents, but benefit the constituents of the opposition party, Republican voters. Food for thought.